Well, good morning, everyone. I'm excited to have you guys join us today as we're having what is actually our 5th meeting for the CHAOSS group. And for those of you who get our newsletter, you'll know that this month marks our 1-year anniversary. So I'll highlight a little bit about what CHAOSS has done in this past year and provide an opportunity for you guys to provide us with your feedback on how we can move forward. So CHAOSS is a collaborative group. We have a steering committee right now that includes the Lake Superior Reserve, NOAA's Office for Coastal Management, Minnesota's Lake Superior Coastal Program, Minnesota Sea Grant, Wisconsin's Coastal Management Program, and Wisconsin Sea Grant. And I'll just put in this plug that we are looking for anyone else who's interested in joining that steering committee. We would love to get some different perspectives and hope that you'll be able to join us. Now, CHAOSS was started as a response to the coastal hazards that were impacting our communities. Sorry, I realize as I'm looking at this that we've got a lot of Minnesota photos. I'll have to start branching out and getting more Wisconsin pictures. But last year we asked our members what were the coastal hazards that were of interest to them. Lakeshore flooding, shoreline erosion, lake levels, and infrastructure vulnerability were the top responses. And we really focused on that in our topics and our programs for the past year. CHAOSS membership is open to anyone who has an interest in coastal hazards. We currently have about 100 members. It's free and there's no commitment or obligations when you join. And right now we have fairly good representation from some of our federal, state, and tribal agencies, local government and tribal government stakeholders and researchers, but we're always welcome and open to anyone who's interested in joining us. CHAOSS meeting attendance, I just like to see where people are coming from. Madison from Sea Grant did a really great job of showing where people have been joining us from. Obviously, you have a very high concentration from Western Lake Superior, but it is good to note that we have folks joining us from Wisconsin, Southeast Wisconsin, particularly Michigan, Illinois, Indiana, and even Ohio, and a few folks that have joined us from outside the Great Lakes. We've been focused on meeting the needs that our members have shared with us, primarily information on ongoing projects and lessons from other communities for some of those top requests. And that's reflected in what we've done in the past year. So I'll share this infographic with you later after the meeting, but in this first year of CHAOSS, we've had several meetings looking at things like water levels, bluff recession and shoreline erosion, the new BRIC program, flood resilience tools and other tools available for helping make your community more resilient, and talking about mitigation planning for hazards and other issues of concern. We've also had from the Lake Superior Reserve set up this really great tool that we want to make sure we promote. That's the Lake Superior High Water Spotter. This is a tool where you can just share your photos. You can use this on your phone and provide some documentation of what these high water impacts are around our coast. So I'm going to put ask you for your feedback. We do have a quick survey that's only going to take you about 5 to 10 minutes. We want to hear a little bit about if CHAOSS has helped you in your work, and if so, how, topics we should be focusing on for future events, and ways that we can better facilitate collaboration. Thank you for those of you who've already taken the survey. Here's some example results. So we've asked about what you've done as a result of participating in CHAOSS, and the top results have been about expanding your network and making new connections to other organizations and programs. So really glad to see that. So I don't want to take a lot of time for this, so let's just quickly review today's agenda. We have a great group of speakers today. First off, we have a coastal engineer and regulatory expert panel that includes Zach Morris from AMI Consulting Engineers, Crystal Von Holt from Wisconsin DNR, and Patricia Fowler from Minnesota DNR. We also are going to hear about a new tool that is really new, hasn't been fully released to us yet, called the Great Lakes Coastal Adaptation Menu. And we have 2 representatives from the Norva Institute of Applied Climate Science, or NIACS, here to talk to us about that. And then what we're really excited about today is we're going to be using breakout rooms that'll give you an opportunity to connect with those speakers and also meet fellow CHAOSS members and participants. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I'm going to introduce our expert panel. But before we get started, just a little bit of background. We are going to have all of our panelists give us a brief presentation. And then once all 3 panelists have spoken, then we will share questions that you provide in the chat with them and have a little bit of a discussion. Before we get started with that, Karina has produced a quick little poll that we can bring up that can help our panelists understand where folks are coming from today and if they have either actually conducted a shoreline project or are planning to do one. So please respond to that very quickly and we will see who's here today.
Looks like responses are slowing down there, Melanie. I'll give it a couple more minutes.
Okay. All right. Do you want to go ahead and end the poll? We'll see what the final results are. Okay. So we have 51% of folks joining us from Minnesota, 31% joining us from Wisconsin, and we have 11% from Michigan, 11% from other states. Interested to hear what those other states are, so please feel free to put that in the chat. And 46% of our respondents said that they have either conducted a project or planning to do so. And 54% said no, not yet. Okay. Well, with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our first speaker today. Zach Morris is an expert in coastal engineering management with over 10 years of experience designing and constructing waterfronts. He's been working at AMI Engineers for 5 years and currently is serving as the Coastal Engineering Department Manager. Zach is very passionate about helping build stronger communities on all levels, not just those coastal engineering wise. He is also currently serving as a technical advisor for the coastal training program at the Lake Superior National Estuarine Research Reserve. And so with that, I'm going to invite Zach to share his screen.
Thank you, Melanie. All right, so can everyone see the screen there, the PowerPoint?
Yep.
That looks good.
Good. All right, so yeah, thank you for inviting me to this. I'm very excited. I'm very passionate about coastal engineering and designing things correctly and make sure we keep the owner's focus in mind throughout that process. So today I'll kind of just go over what it's like to work with a coastal engineer. And yeah, look forward to hearing any feedback during the panel discussion. So thank you. So the overview and objectives today will be, how can a coastal engineer help you? When should you contact a coastal engineer? And things you should know before contacting a coastal engineer. And lastly, what to expect during the coastal engineering process. The photo to the right here is typical of the South Shore of Lake Superior right now, northern Wisconsin right here. And where you have this clayey or sandy bluffs, and they're getting very eroded rapidly from the higher water levels and wave action, especially with the recent storm events that we've had. So a pretty typical scenario. So what can be done to stop this? And is there any options to maybe get some of the land back that I lost potentially? So those are things to consider throughout the process as well. So I get a fair amount of calls. I want to say it's probably 20–25% of the calls I get are, no, I tried something, it didn't work. So we try to go in and try to help out and say, well, what can be done, and what's your budget, and just try to work with the owner to develop a practical solution for them that works and is resilient for what they're looking for. So there's some other photos I was going to share with you, but some of those projects are actually underneath litigation, unfortunately, because it's such a large investment and they failed. So it's kind of sad when you see that happen. but it does happen. So I'd say that, first and foremost, make sure you select someone who's qualified in either the construction or the engineering to do this work, because that really determines the success of your project, and it's a very large investment typically for people. So make sure you have the right team is important. Here's a North Shore typical erosion project that we're working on. This one, I was out there, the photo to the upper left. I was out there for that photo, and then roughly 10 days later, I went back out there after a storm event, and this client lost another 10 to 15 feet of this shoreline, which was very concerning because the septic system was right at the bluff edge because it receded so far back. So it's one thing to address the shoreline, but sometimes you really have to, because you have a septic system there, some other critical infrastructure that needs to be protected. So photos to the left of the conditions out there, and then photos to the right is the restoration that was performed there. Which the one to the right is a hard armor in a shoreline revetment, so we call it armor stone, just big rock, strategically placed. Here's another one on the North Shore again. This one, again, there was a failing slope and there's previous stabilization that took place. It was unfortunately not sufficient. The way it was designed, it just wasn't designed for the long term. And what happened is that the toe of the slope gave away from the high water levels. And when that gave away, the entire system came tumbling down. So what kind of options do you have here? Again, this one was some nice plantings up on top with a rock revetment underneath, with very large sized boulders because of the massive waves that were coming into the shoreline. I will say there's a few people on this phone call that were privy to this project, and oftentimes contractors get in a rush about projects, and sometimes clients as well, and they're really pushing hard, but you still have to get all the permits, all your ducks in a row, or at least let them know, hey, this is an emergency, this is our plan. Have that conversation before you start construction. It happens a lot where people don't talk with the agencies, they start construction and then they get fined and there's a big issue. So just that being said, want to put a plug in there for that. This one's more of a resiliency planning. So person's going into his retirement, looking to create this shoreline that's not going to keep slowly sloughing off at the back of his property right here, which compromises his foundations. So to do that, what kind of options do you have? This one resulted in a concrete seawall, was the most practical option for this location. And with that, it also, an amenity was installed there, which was a little deck. So oftentimes people are really focused on just the shoreline, but there's other things to consider, such as, what kind of small amenity can I get? Can I get a trail down to the water for beach access? Can I get a deck? Can I, what are the options? And there's also permitting issues with some of those structures, right? So you have to consider that as well, but that's part of the process to work with. We also, coastal engineers will gladly help you with feasibility studies for your project. If you have a larger scale project, like a municipality, or sometimes even marinas for private residents can be on a larger scale sometimes. So this one was, there's wave overtopping, the structures were degrading, so replacement was required. There was sand transporting into the marina. So you can see the sand pile over here on top of the boardwalk. So there's a little bit of sediment transport issues. And then the water quality, there was a whole lot of flushing activities through here. So it was kind of stagnant water. And this is an even bigger scale project where this one's actually in Michigan, but looking at, really a massive feasibility study of what's going on here. There's beach engineering required here. We have an unstable inlet. This natural inlet from this river right here comes down and it's migrated to the north over time because of the breakwater out here, likely is one of the reasons why. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why, but that's one. So looking at the options, how can we restore the site so we actually have a shipping canal for the ships that come through here that provide a lot of, that help the economy a lot for Lake Superior region. So when should you contact a coastal engineer? I always say the sooner the better. Never hurts to call one up and talk to, a situation that you might be experiencing or over the phone or via email, or maybe you have some plans in the future for a dock or something. Starting those discussions earlier is always a good thing. It never hurts. And then the coastal engineer should be able to provide you with enough information to make an informed decision. What's the permitting requirements? What's the anticipated cost for not just design, but construction as well? And like I said, a lot of times this is done by most companies free of charge. So just trying to show you your options and you can make that informed decision. Things that I recommend for you to know before contacting a coastal engineer would be, what is the history of your property? In the history of your property, if there's any repairs that have been done to date, on your property, whether it's for the shoreline or for other features of your property. Do you have any existing conditions as well as data, such as building plans, lot lines, survey markers, geotechnical information, and so forth? And then a big thing is also the timeline and the budget. So what's your timeline and what's your budget? Do you have amenities that you're looking to install? And do you have a preference of green versus gray design? Some people love concrete. They really want concrete. That's great. Some people want living shorelines. That's also great. What's the feasibility of each of these options given your location? And what is your preference? Because designs can try to tailor to your preference as well, to the fullest extent practical. And lastly, a general knowledge of the water levels and climate change is always beneficial too. Not required, that can be educated throughout the process, but general knowledge, it does help. The bottom right picture just shows it's courtesy of the SAGE continuum, which is the systems approach to geomorphic engineering. Essentially, it just goes over the different type of living shoreline techniques versus the gray harder structure techniques. So things that you should expect from the coastal engineering process, I would say have that initial discussion over the phone or via email, whatever your preference is. Likely have the initial site assessment, have the engineer come out there or the contractor, depending upon your preference, determine the actions recommended, the costs associated, and the timelines for that. Sometimes there's restrictions on when you can do these projects because of fish windows and other environmental concerns. At that point, the owner can make an informed decision. And if they move forward, the next step would be doing a site survey, a detailed site assessment, generating the designs, the cost estimates. And sometimes, depending upon the site and what you're requesting, it could require more information, such as wave and sediment transport analyses. After that, the owner makes a decision with all the information, the cost, resiliency, maintenance, etc., and moves into permitting. And after permitting is approved, then you can do construction documents, bidding, and then construction. I am out of time, so thank you for that. And I look forward to having the panel discussion after this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zach. That was a really informative presentation. Again, we're going to hold questions until all of our speakers presented, and we're going to move towards Crystal Von Holt. She is a water management specialist with the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. She's been working to protect wetlands and waterways since 2008. Before working for the state, Crystal graduated from Eckerd College, which is down in St. Petersburg, Florida, with a Bachelor's of Science in Psychology in 2002, and from the University of Wisconsin, Green Bay, with a Master's of Science in Environmental Science and Policy. She's an avid traveler and outdoor enthusiast. In college, Crystal had the opportunity to sail and dive around the Galapagos Islands. Growing up in an Air Force family, she spent time living in and traveling around Europe during high school while stationed in Germany. And Crystal now spends time teaching her two girls to respect and enjoy our natural resources. So with that, I'm going to invite Crystal to share her screen. And actually, I can already see it. Looks good.
All right. Thank you so much for the introduction. I'm so happy to be here. I am watching the clock. I will keep it to my time allotment. I will be focusing on the permitting process and state regulations for waterway work in the state of Wisconsin. We have a lot of miles of coastal shoreline, and just like in Minnesota and Michigan, this is a very hot topic for the past couple of years. Absolutely at the forefront of all of our coastal staff. So um, it's a really important topic, and we have a lot. Let's see if I can get this, a lot of involvement with the communities to help look at long-term solutions. For state permitting in Wisconsin, a little bit of our background for the waterway program. We have a long history and a very important role in protecting the public trust. So I usually start with the first couple highlights of what do we regulate and why do we regulate. The program at the Wisconsin is here to protect rights for use of that public and private use, hunting, fishing, uh, natural scenic beauty, sunset photographs. So what we do regulate, what we focus on is considered Chapter 30 in our statute, and that's that permitting authority for anything in and around a navigable or public waterway. These regulations date back, they came over to the US from the Magna Carta in England, and before that there are roots in Roman law. It became part of our Constitution in 1848, so it's a very important element in our state history. In that statute, in Chapter 30, our role is ingrained in this public trust doctrine. It's this concept that embodies several different documents and regulations and concepts for our state. You can find elements of it in the state constitution. We have a lot of laws that are enacted that are aimed at protecting that public resource for the citizens of the state. And we also have case law set forth in historic cases that help determine fundamental definitions and approaches that the state follows consistently so that we can make sure that we have the public trust in mind. We, when we evaluate permits, the public trust includes a lot of different types of public interests. Here are a list, a pretty general list that includes most of the different activities that you can find around our public resource: water bodies, commercial navigation, recreational navigation, the different activities that you would find on the water. Water quality and water quantity are some elements that maybe some waterfront landowners don't always think of first, but when there are times of high water and floods or really low water and drought, then the quality and the quantity become pretty apparent. I will breeze over the application process. I won't get into too many details. Overall, in the state of Wisconsin, if you're looking to do a coastal shoreline project, generally a permit is needed. It depends on certain sensitive areas. Most of the shoreline on Lake Michigan, there are permits required. Superior is a little bit different. When there is a permit required, when you submit an application to the state through our DNR permit process, we provide a copy to the Army Corps office, so the federal office for those federal waterway regulations. It is a joint process, which is pretty easy for a customer. Submit that application to the state and you automatically have a copy sent over to Army Corps. Everything is done online, from uploading narratives, site photos, completing the application forms, and even paying for the application fee. I took some screenshots of what that water permit system looks like online. So as a user or an applicant, this is the home screen. We're looking to first, one of the first steps would be to register, kind of create your profile or account. And that is where you can then apply for many different types of Wisconsin DNR permits, waterway permits being one of them. So you can scroll down, find exactly the type of permit that you want to apply for. So for coastal shorelines, it would be a waterway permit. We also call it a Chapter 30 permit. That's referring to the set of statute authority for navigable waterways. Under the waterway permits, there's a whole list of activities. We regulate a lot of different types of projects and construction in and around navigable waterways. Specifically for coastal shorelines or the Great Lakes, it's lakeshore erosion control. There are a couple different permit types. I will cover that after the walkthrough online. The Great Lakes permit process is limited to an individual permit, or the IP. So you can see on the right side, begin IP or individual permit application is where a user would enter into that system. When you are in the system, there are several tabs at the top for completing each section of a permit application. We're gathering information about location, contact information, narrative, so describe your project, provide photos of the existing landscape, the shoreline as it is today, project plans, contractor information, and then any other application components that may be required. Sometimes we have requirements for certain studies, engineering studies. It really depends what's being proposed. Specifically, each type of regulated activity will have a unique set of requirements. So for the Great Lakes coastal lakeshore erosion control projects, when you click on that, you can find what is specifically and uniquely required for that permit process. It'll help walk you through the different requirements so that when you get to the number 8, when you get to the end of signing and submitting your form, if you haven't provided all of the required uploads or documents to make a complete application, it will tell that to you, and you can go back and add or complete that section. Then you can sign and submit. So it's a little bit of self-regulating, making sure that you do get all of the required elements submitted. As with everything else technology related, please save often. And there at the bottom of each of these forms or tabs, there's a continue button. Sometimes people overlook that and they kind of get stuck in a form. So the continue button and the save button are very important for moving your way through the online system. Application requirements, I covered this a little bit already. Basically, put on paper or put in the application whatever we need to know to look at on paper to try to understand your project. We don't always, especially with the pandemic conditions, we don't always have the opportunity to come out for a site visit. So really good photos, standing at the shoreline, looking up, looking down shore, taking those pictures, clear plans with dimensions and volumes and rock sizes, lengths and heights, all of those details. I tell people I'd rather see more information than not enough to help keep that permit review process moving forward smoothly. If there isn't enough information there, that's not a problem. We catch it and we put the application review on pause until we have all of the information needed. So trying to avoid the delays and the pauses, providing a full set of details early on is helpful for going through that review process quickly. When we make permit decisions of approving permits, we are balancing the private and the public interest. Generally speaking, it's a private interest project protecting a private property shoreline. For that private interest of, I want to maintain my structures, I don't want foundation damage. That's a private interest. They're interested in that single property and those structures under their ownership. But their work to protect their private interest is crossing over into a public realm or the public resource. So that's where we need to understand, what is that private interest? How can we achieve your project while also minimizing the impact, significant adverse environmental impact to the public resource and to other adjoining riparians or waterfront landowners or up and down the shore. So we look at the design, what are the immediate short-term impacts and also what are those long-term impacts. We are not able to issue permits if that balancing act isn't reached. So if it's a heavily private interest project with real significant adverse environmental impacts in the state of Wisconsin, we are not able to grant that permit. It doesn't meet the criteria described through all those documents and concepts making up the public trust doctrine. And that's where we work with contractors or consultants and landowners to come to a middle ground. What can we permit? What can be proposed and completed that meets the public trust criteria to protect that private interest, but also have a minimized impact on the public realm? Again, not too much detail, but just to cover the different permit types in the state of Wisconsin. If it's not an exempt project, there are requirements for exemptions, which means you don't actually have to obtain the permit. So when you do need a permit, we have two different permit tracks, the general permit or a GP and the individual permit or the IP. Again, for coastal shorelines where permits are required, it is strictly limited in statute to the individual permit process. It does have a 3 to 4 month time review. Quick ones I can get through that process closer to 3 months. If there are delays that are not expected or the applicant takes a while to respond, then it could be 4 months or even longer, depending on how responsive the applicant is or isn't. The IP process does require a public notice period, a 30-day public notice. So the project details are published in the local newspaper, and it provides the opportunity for public involvement in the process. That's a huge part of our program and our state history, is having that public involvement in projects that are going to impact the public resource. So we have an opportunity for the public to participate in the process. And then after those comments are received and we evaluate them, then we issue that permit decision, whatever that may be. That is our program, a permitting program in a nutshell. We've had, of course, some challenges with the last couple of years trying to figure out how to get through that process quicker when there are very urgent shoreline erosion events where there are structures in danger. So if you have, in the state of Wisconsin, if you have shoreline and you're thinking about projects for your shore, please reach out to the Waterway Program, water management specialists, and we can definitely help figure out which permit process you can fit in and how to get through that quickly.
Thank you so much, Crystal. That was a really great overview, and it's really nice to hear a little bit more about the background from Wisconsin side. So again, we're going to hold questions until our last speaker goes. I'm excited to introduce Patricia, or better known to those of us who work with her, Patty Fowler from Minnesota DNR. Patty Fowler is the DNR area hydrologist. I'm sure she'll go over how that's a little bit different perhaps than Wisconsin side for Carleton and South St. Louis counties. So for those of you who may not be from this area, that does include the city of Duluth and the port. She's currently actually covering both Cook and Lake counties right now. So she's got a lot of responsibilities added to her plate recently. She's been with the DNR for 26 years. I'm assuming she started in kindergarten. And she spent the last 16 years in northeastern Minnesota. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Patty.
Thank you, Melanie, for that introduction, and thank you to the CHAOS group for having me here today for this presentation. I'm going to go ahead and get that started. Oops. Okay.
I can see your screen. You're not in presentation mode if you'd like to.
Okay, thank you. I can't see the meeting platform when I have it in presentation mode. So here we go.
It looks good.
Okay, thank you. So hello to everyone. Let's see. All right, so for today, how to prepare for shoreline work on Lake Superior. I plan to talk about common types of projects that DNR has issued permits for during recent high water years, the last number of years, several years. DNR water permitting and design, challenges to designing effective projects, early coordination, including a project planning list. So reasons projects are proposed. Water resources are natural systems that experience water level fluctuations, storms, and erosion as natural processes. And sometimes these natural processes can interrupt life. It affects city infrastructure, including roads and trails and structures of other kinds, including homes, private property that exists along the shoreline, sometimes dramatically. The image in this slide is showing a picture of a seawall that failed. It was flanked and overtopped, and so you can see the eroding shoreline behind it. DNR structures commonly issue, DNR structures, excuse me, DNR commonly issues permits for on the North Shore. In the last several years, we've seen revetments, proposals for seawalls, proposals for retaining walls, repair to failing retaining walls, and repairs to failing revetments, and gabion structures. The image we're looking at is showing that same wall that I had in the previous slide, showing a new installation of a pretty significant tieback wall to stabilize that existing feature. So that's repair to an existing seawall. So the ordinary high water level of Lake Superior shore is an important piece of information when planning a project. It defines that the DNR's jurisdiction, separating it from the shoreland area that's regulated by local units of government. The ordinary high water level is a term that can be misunderstood. For example, on inland lakes, an ordinary high water level may represent or does represent a still water elevation. It's not an average or a high, it's where the water has been long enough to leave evidence on the landscape. And what's unique about Lake Superior is the evidence varies across the lake and even across a site. And that is due to the dynamic of Lake Superior. So for Lake Superior, the ordinary high is delineated by primarily by a permanent vegetation line that's resulted from storm lake levels and from wave runup. Along Minnesota Point, the evidence is expressed along a dune system. So again, a little bit different from, say, for example, the image here showing the two different types of bedrock interfacing in one reach. So factors in designing effective projects. Coastal shore environments are complex and complicated. We're hearing that in the other presentations this morning as well. There's the challenge that no one solution, of course, fits all situations. The complexity is due to these varied geology and the interactions with the hydrologic factors and how those vary from site to site. And also how land development and land alteration change the way water moves across and through through the land. Other complexity is increased frequency and intensity of rainfall and storms that can affect risk at sites. So design and engineering challenges, water levels fluctuate and create erosion potential at both high water and low water conditions. The scale and power of waves is a challenge. And as I mentioned, in considering what an ordinary high water level is, it's the scale and power of those waves are expressed across the lake in different ways, depending on many factors of the site. There's a high cost to projects. Zach Morris touched on that. Large scale projects with lots of technical analysis involved in the design is part of why those project costs are high, and also the scale of the types of solutions that are installed. There may be limited availability of engineers having this coastal engineering expertise. And lastly, problems can't just be engineered. They need to include a comprehensive approach to the site, looking at vegetation stabilization on failing bluffs and slopes and that stormwater management component. So for landowners, planning projects, education is important to understand the coastal environment and effective solutions. That education helps landowners understand what is unique about the particular landscape that they're working in, and what those natural functions are. The technical support, connecting landowners with available resources, such as SWCD's CHAOS, Sea Grant, NOAA, Minnesota DNR's coastal program, and others, too many to name, is an important resource in planning. And then also, I think others touched on this, I know others touched on this, that early coordination element is critical for successful projects. So design matters. Managing for erosion on steep slopes or bluffs. Successful projects are designed to be effective without being over-designed. So what does that mean? It means avoiding disturbances on or near the slopes to minimize slope erosion. Protecting existing vegetation where possible and establishing new vegetation to stabilize slopes. Avoiding placement of stormwater treatment facilities or septic drain fields on slopes or near the top of these slopes. regulating placement of structures and land alterations in the bluff and steep slope areas. And these two images are just highlighting those factors that I mentioned, showing on the left how this particular application involves stabilizing the shoreline with vegetation after grading. This is an installation at the toe to protect the lower part of the slope with a revetment installation and some greening element to it, planting vegetation in those gaps. To the right, this is getting at how to address that stormwater and vegetation really and other structures on site. So it's showing grading water away from the bank face. In this particular site, they're berming with vegetation at the top to prevent that water from flowing over the top of the slope. And they've planted this slope with a vegetation and including a natural fiber blanket here. So just a green approach here. So the project planning early coordination checklist. First of all, very important for landowners to consider defining the project for themselves, the purpose of the project and the needs, so that when they're working with others, they can articulate that piece as a starting point. Others touched on this, that early coordination element is very important to the success of projects. So that means contacting agencies early to talk about a project, to talk about project scope. And here I'm saying pre-application meetings are encouraged, absolutely, emphasis. So that some of the elements that are covered in early coordination include identifying designs to meet state rules and permitting requirements. It costs money to develop the designs and the plans that are part of permitting, and so having the discussions on how to meet those requirements saves money on that plan development. It provides an opportunity to discuss designs to better address the problems and the opportunities to also the opportunities to address the uniqueness of each site. So that's just getting at the idea that we can look for solutions that optimize the protection and also optimize for protecting the natural features themselves from an aesthetic standpoint, from a habitat standpoint, and recreationally. How do you use that site? Are you using the beach, and how does a solution that addresses erosion maybe change or affect that? So getting the right technical expertise is important to that. This early coordination is something that makes permitting process easier and quicker. I want to just highlight that timeline is important here. That timeline includes the application review process itself, but also all of the pre-work that's done, the application process is something like 60 to 150 days, depending on the scope and scale of projects. And I kind of touched on the expertise part already, but looking for an expert that's best suited to find solutions that meet your needs and the purpose. Having the ability to address unique aspects of the site, including the character. And as also consider a range of options, including options to address the near shore environment. I kind of touched on that, the beach access, the environmental impact aspect, and habitat aspect, as well as the visual. And that's it. Thank you. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Patty. That was really helpful to have it from the Minnesota perspective. So I'm going to invite Crystal and Zach to turn their cameras back on if they want to, and I'm going to share a couple of questions that have come through in the chat so far. First question that I have, and this may be aimed more towards Zach, but just hear if Crystal and Patty have some feedback as well. What types of qualifications should we be looking at when you're hiring a contractor or a coastal engineer for a project like this?
Definitely previous experience is huge. What's a reputation? Even the regulatory agencies might have worked with some of these people. Not that they can write that on paper, but I would say just do a good vetting process, ask for qualifications. Any competent coastal engineer or contractor will be happy to give you project profiles, references that you can actually call and validate that these are truly reputable contractors or engineers for that matter. It's one thing to provide these projects, but also to provide those clients that you can call and say, hey, what went well? What were the challenges? You know, I think to me, if I'm investing in a large project like this as an owner, I would make those calls.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Following up on that question, what kind of green infrastructure training do coastal engineers have available to them? Are folks finding coastal engineers feel just as comfortable recommending and designing green infrastructure projects compared to the gray infrastructure?
Yeah, I can take a little bit of a stab at that. The green infrastructure, there's a lot of training available for that. So there's a green infrastructure and then there's the living shorelines, and sometimes those get married together. So in particular, I'm not so focused on the green infrastructure necessarily. That's other divisions in my company. But on the living shorelines, that type of application, there is lots of webinars available. NOAA hosts a lot of these as well. The coastal training program, the reserve hosts them as well. So I think that there's good living shoreline treatments available. And Patty or Crystal, if you want to address the other question for the green infrastructure, that'd be great.
In Wisconsin, we do encourage green infrastructure and or that living natural shoreline, at least to be a consideration. It may just be include elements of it, kind of a combination of some hard armoring and living shoreline techniques. We, as regulators, we don't have the luxury of designing projects, but I do offer a lot of conversational concepts of, can you look into this? Can you tell us why maybe more of a living shoreline isn't going to work? Why are you proposing concrete or hard armoring? So it doesn't mean that we're not able to work to a permit as an end result, but it is kind of that balancing of, if there's a way to achieve what you want to achieve with more natural designs and products, then we definitely need to look in that direction.
We're seeing a lot of questions pop up. This one is actually aimed directly at Patty. Does the Minnesota DNR Public Waters Permit have vegetation standards that it requires for replanting that shoreline?
Jen, thanks for that question. I think that yes, it's built into the rules in that you want to ensure that you're stabilizing using natural materials to the extent possible. Crystal talked a little bit, touched on that. But you know, really, it depends on the landscape and what activities or what kind of projects you're implementing. It may be that the vegetated part of the slope is really within that LGU interface with public water permitting. So we just work with the community to make sure that if it's not something that's covered under Minnesota DNR permitting, that it's addressed through or with the land use authority.
Yeah, I was gonna piggyback on that and say a lot of times the counties also impose certain requirements, and it's becoming more prominent as of lately that you have a certain density of shrubs, or if you remove a certain amount of essentially native landscape to restore that.
And we have so many great questions that came through. I'm going to make this our last one just because we ran a little bit over. But for those of you who aren't getting your question answered right now, just know that in the breakout room, all 3 of our presenters have agreed to stay. And so you can actually go and talk about this with them. So last question I'm going to share, does there seem to be an increased interest among property owners for Minnesota and Wisconsin to engineer those softer shoreline management approaches? Or is coastal armoring still the typical go-to?
Well, I can jump in from Wisconsin. I think we definitely see more of the hard armoring, just using riprap. And I'm not sure, there may be different reasons behind it. Sometimes I think it appears contractor driven. Sometimes it's landowners who look up and down and see what their neighbors have and they want the same. And sometimes it is site conditions that just call for big boulders, hard armoring to handle that energy. But I always throw in the conversation the idea of native vegetation and keeping that vegetated buffer along the shoreline. Rock can certainly help a lot protect against erosion, but a combination of having well-designed, well-constructed riprap or revetments with native vegetation is going to be really your it'll beef it up. It'll be the long-term solution.
Zach or Patty, do you have anything you want to follow up with on that?
I guess I can fill in really quick. Yeah, I think you hit it right on the head, Crystal. Having some of those softer features, some of that native plantings really does provide for the resiliency long term. Highly recommended. It is, site by site basis, but there's no reason why you can't have native vegetation and plantings above essentially the ordinary high water mark that's defined by the DNR, where that erosion stops to occur and the waves don't run up that far. There's no reason why we can't have living shorelines beyond that. Now, from that high water mark down to the water line, that's a little bit more vulnerable depending upon your wave climate and near shore wave environments. But it's always something to consider. And there's other options to create this living shorelines that people are not so familiar with, such as growing structures and trying to create that aquatic habitat as well for fish and so forth. So there's lots of fun options. It's just talking and trying to vet those options out.
Well, thank you so much for all of the information that you've shared. And I'm going to pass this over to Madison. She's going to introduce our next speakers.
Thanks, Melanie, and thanks to the speakers that have presented so far. We're going to pivot a little bit. So we're going to back up and transition to a tool that's in development and we're excited to hear about from our presenters today. So this is the Great Lakes Coastal Adaptation Menu. You might remember if you attended CHAOSS a couple months back, we heard about tribal adaptation menu. This is from the same team that brought you that great tool. So today we'll be hearing from Kristen Schmidt, and Kristen is a climate change adaptation specialist working in support of the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, or NIACS, and the Northern Forest Climate Hub. She works with a variety of partners to create new tools and to plan and execute training that helps natural resource professionals integrate climate change into their work. And so with that, I welcome Kristen and Danielle, her colleague today, who will be presenting on the Great Lakes Climate Adaptation Menu, or Coastal Adaptation Menu.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Madison, and to the CHAOSS group for having us here. So this is a bit of a pivot. As Madison mentioned, I hate to cut off all the really interesting Q&A that was going on. So hopefully people can join breakout rooms later to get their questions answered. But I'm going to be talking a little bit about a tool that we're developing for climate change adaptation for Great Lakes coastal ecosystems. NIACS, Danielle and I are facilitating this effort, but it's being led by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Just a quick note, both Danielle and I work for the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, as Madison mentioned, and the focus of our organization is really on helping practitioners, helping natural resources managers integrate climate change and climate change science into their management. So the focus of our organization, of the tool I'm going to be talking about today, is kind of at that planning practitioner level. And we work with a variety of different organizations to do this work that you see below there, and many more outside of this. So the tool that I'm going to be talking about or introducing quickly here today is, we refer to it as the menu of adaptation strategies and approaches for Great Lakes coastal ecosystems. And the idea behind a menu is one that's been mentioned already today a couple of times. There's no one right way to respond to climate change. The actions that you are going to choose to implement depend a lot on your individual situation, what your goals and objectives for that landscape are. And so our focus was on creating a tool that's flexible to many different management situations. The idea behind an adaptation menu is really just what it sounds like. A menu is a collection of possible adaptation actions organized into different categories or general strategies, as we call them. And it's really meant to allow the user to pick and choose actions that make sense for their own planning scenario and their area. And the menu is meant to be used as part of a broader decision-making process. Here, I'm showing the one that we work with a lot at NIACS, called the Adaptation Workbook. This is just an adaptive management cycle that explicitly includes climate change. And we work on this process with a lot of different types of managers, natural resources practitioners. The menu is what we use in step 4, where we are actively thinking about and identifying and developing adaptation tactics. And it's after you've kind of considered a lot of the potential climate change impacts and threats for your project area or landscape. I'll just mention that the Great Lakes Ecosystem Menu is one of many other menus that we have published and in development. So this is a model that we've used before for other natural resources focus areas. If you want more details on any of the specifics, I'd encourage you to come and join us in the breakout room in just a little bit. I know the slide is very wordy, but I did think it was important just to mention the overall strategies or general categories that we have this menu sorted into. And in general, those follow a continuum of climate change adaptation ideas, from resistance to resilience to transition. With a few slight exceptions, this 6th strategy here, design and modify infrastructure to accommodate future conditions, really runs the gamut of all 3 of these adaptation options. One of the benefits of a menu, we feel, is to really help planners and practitioners connect the dots between on-the-ground actions and the overall direction that they're hoping to move with their climate change adaptation. And this is just one example of that idea, or what that looks like, connecting the dots. So if you're thinking about transitioning an ecosystem to be more climate adapted, more in line with future conditions, a strategy within that from the menu, this broad category, might be to adjust coastal systems to cope with altered hydrology and shoreline erosion. A more specific approach within that might be to maintain and create conditions for inland and waterward plant and animal movement. And so specific tactics that you might develop for your site, it might involve regrading to remove elevation barriers for vegetation to move. It might involve managing invasive species in important retreat areas inland. So that's just an example of walking from the broad to the specific here. So quick note on where we are with this project. We've spent some time with our authors doing a literature review and compiling that literature, collating strategies and approaches, and identifying more specific tactics as examples. We've written an early draft and received some feedback on that. And over the next couple of months, what we really hope to do is incorporate that early feedback and then test this with real world management projects to see how it works in a live setting. And I'll just mention that, Danielle and I are the conveners of this effort. We're not the coastal experts here. Our author group represents all of these organizations, and they're the ones that are providing that coastal filter and expertise on all of this. And so with that, if you have any questions, please feel free to contact us or join us in the breakout room.
Thanks so much, Kristen, for that overview of your exciting new project. I invite anyone that has a question for Kristen or Danielle to type it up in the chat, or you can be brave and unmute yourself and ask verbally. We'll take maybe a question or two before handing it back over, and then we can leave some deep dive questions for those breakout rooms, as Kristen mentioned. So if you have any questions, maybe everyone's typing it in right now. I'll look for folks that are going off on mute.
I'll be brave and ask one. So thinking about this need to actually test it out on projects, you're looking for partners to do that, or is that something that you already have lined up?
Yeah, great question, Melanie, and great chance for us to give a little plug. We are actively looking for projects that want to test this. We've got a few feelers out already. And so we're kind of looking for projects that are at that right stage and kind of the right focus. So this is obviously a broader planning tool. It's meant really for before you get to that more detailed engineering design, where you might be bringing in someone like the folks we heard about or we've heard from earlier on this call. So yes, we are looking for folks who might want to help us test this. And I think Danielle just put some more info in the chat there related to that.
Thanks, Melanie, and thanks, Kristen. I'm not seeing any other comments, so I'm sure that there's folks that are thinking about if their project fits that timeline, and we invite them to join you in the breakout room in a bit. But I'm going to turn it back to Melanie, who's going to describe those rooms more and tell us what the next step is for our meeting.
Yes. Well, I'm actually going to leave Karina to describe those rooms for us and tell us about this cool feature that is new to us in Zoom. But before we go into the breakout rooms, I wanted to just kind of close out some of the pieces of the meeting because we won't be coming back all together. So first of all, I want to thank all of our speakers for joining us today, and thank you for participating. I hope that you gain something from this, and that hopefully you'll be able to stay for those breakout rooms and actually connect with other people who are attending and our speakers. First of all, I wanted to remind you that this meeting is being recorded. We'll share that link after the meeting and the presentation slides that our speakers have shared with us. Again, I would really appreciate it if you would take our short survey and give us your feedback on where we should be focusing for future meetings and other ways that we can support collaboration through CHAOSS. And with that, I will just remind you that we'll be planning our next meeting for July. So if you have a topic or something that you want to share, please feel free to reach out to me or anyone else on the steering committee. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Karina, and she's going to share all of the details about how we can get into our breakout rooms.